So, Brian, did you know that this is episode number 37? Are you aware of the significance of the number 37?
37 is Ben Aquino's favorite number.
That is absolutely correct. For about probably close to 13, 14 years now, whenever I'm running a youth ministry activity and I'm determining which team goes first in whatever game, I always say I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 100. And any student that knows me knows that it's always going to be 37. And that's been one of my pleasures here, is seeing like how many syllables of that sentence I can get out before somebody shouts out 37. It's usually, I'm thinking, 37! Yes, Ben's, James Swanson, that is correct.
Ben's favorite number, and people always remember that because it's a good number to remember because it's kind of unusual. And just like Ben, it's unusual, it's prime, it's all those things.
I'm pretty prime.
It was your age for a year, too.
Yeah, for a bad year. That's a rough year.
It was indeed. So much for a favorite number. Huh?
Welcome, friends, to LEAFline podcast number 37.
Hi, everyone.
I am Bhattacharya.
I'm the Brian Ralston guy, and we're glad you're with us again. Thanks for joining us in this 37th episode. Crazy. When we first started doing this, we thought, 2 or 3 weeks while the pandemic's shutting us down and we need other ministry. Oh, yeah, still going. Though there are shots going out now, I hear, so vaccines and such, so people getting jabbed all over the place, so that's a good sign at least.
Yeah.
Welcome in.
Can I get an update? And now we're on updates. And Brian, I can't see my paper because there's an elephant in the way.
Gee, there's a giant elephant in the room. Let's call upon that elephant and talk about a certain elephant because it is a mixed blessing that we're going to share this news. Sad for us, great for Ben and Kristen. They are moving to Visalia, California. Ben is stepping into a role at the Nazarene Church in Visalia as worship arts pastor. And yeah, that decision was made this past week. Right, Ben?
Yeah, we sent it out in the Leaf Brief on Friday. And I actually made the decision the day before that. And it's been an amazing 10 years here at Centenary. But yeah, gosh, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of feelings.
Yeah, so it's mixed emotions in a lot of ways for all of us, for Ben and Kristen, and for me and Kathy. It's been more than a 10-year journey in some ways because we've been through so much together, and Ben and I have worked together for so long. And as some of you have commented,
closer to 25 years.
Yeah, it feels like a lot longer in some ways, but it's also been a delight for many of those years as well. And as some of you have commented, Ben and I work really well together. You can tell that from the podcast. But we have also worked really well together in a lot of other ministry over the last 10 plus years. And honestly, one of my hardest things when he first got the job offer was, how will we be able to do ministry? How will I be able to do ministry without Ben around? And some of you may still be in that stage. That's understandable. But I remind you that God always provides. And just as God has provided this for Ben and Kristen, he'll provide for Centenary. Ben and Kristen are moving to the town where Kristen's family lived, where Kristen grew up. The Naz Church is actually where Kristen's parents are involved. And Kristen's sister and brother-in-law also live there. And Ben and Kristen will have a great home very close to family. And then Ben's family is just a short little drive up the road in Fresno. His mom, brother, sister, both sisters, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and nieces in Fresno. So family will be a lot closer, and that's really good for Ben and Kristen with Isaiah. And so it'll be an amazing time for them long-term. Short-term, it's rough to sell a house, move, buy a house, start a new job, close out a long-time ministry job. That's really tough. And so
that's the easy part, though. Like, honestly, the work is the easy part. Like, the thought of not being here anymore. And honestly, not getting to continue in ministry with Centenary and the exciting and wonderful new direction I'm seeing from Pastor Tim and his wife, Gina. Like, that was one of the hardest parts of this decision, was just like, that's going to continue, and I don't get to be part of it in the same way I would have.
Right. And that's really been hard for Ben. Walking with him through this decision, that was one of the biggest factors that was causing him to, consider staying here. Was Tim and Gina have been amazing, positive energy and vision of what is possible for God's church, Centenary. And Ben was a big part of that early on here. And so he was really enjoying being a part of that and wanting to continue on. But I think, as we'll talk about maybe later, there's great opportunities in both churches, and Ben's going to be part of the Visalia Nazarene Church, and I think a big contributor in a big positive way for the ministry there. So, yeah, so more on this as we go. But
So, in other updates, the drive-through nativity is this Saturday, December 19th from 5 to 7 p.m. The duration of the program that each car will experience as it drives through is of a length to where we'll only be able to get about 60 cars through during those 2 hours. And so I hope that whoever's listening gets to be one of them. The following day, the Family Christmas program will debut online as our online service at 9 a.m. on YouTube. You'll get a link to it in the Leaf Brief, and we should have outdoor services that day, weather permitting. And gosh, I hope we have outdoor services that day, because I love playing Christmas music, and I was deprived of that this past Sunday.
Yeah, and so definitely in-person worship, if weather permitting and everything continues to look okay for that, that'll be great. And then you also have the online option to watch. It's going to be a great family presentation, so check that out either Sunday at 9 or anytime after that. Ben and his team put a lot of work into it. The young families and a lot of folks participate. A lot of children are involved. It's a great effort. So
we got about 40 people from the congregation.
Yeah, and under these conditions, pandemic conditions, remember, you can't have 40 people in the room at the same time. So Ben and his team, Jonathan Swanson, and Tim and Gina, and Cindy, and my sister Cindy Duenas, and Christy Emmerich, that group of folks did amazing work to get families in to record their parts, video, but in small enough groups, everybody being very careful and distance and all that good stuff, and then got them in and out. And Ben and his team were here for many, many hours to record all this. Yeah. So great effort, and it's really cool. So check it out and share it with people too. It has a great message behind it.
Okay, so that's...
And then Christmas Eve is December 24th, just so you know, like it always is. And so we are having an outside opportunity to celebrate Christmas Eve. So stay tuned for more details on that. There will be silent night and candles and such. It'll be good. So make sure you put that on your radar. So, recommendations?
Recommendations, give it a try.
That's what we're doing right now. Do you want to go first, or shall I?
Sure. Let me share. I've been listening, as always, to audiobooks and podcasts. That's what I do. A podcast that I think I mentioned a long time ago, but I kind of went away from it for a while, but I come back. It's called More Than a Song, and it's a podcast that talks about the biblical background behind certain songs. And they're in a Christmas segment now, which is kind of cool. They take some modern worship / Christmas type songs and kind of give the biblical background behind it. So it's kind of interesting. So if you're looking for
primarily the modern ones?
Yes. They're not really doing the traditional carols so far. They're doing contemporary worship type songs.
I have a lot of feelings and thoughts on that subject.
Yeah, exactly. And so do they. It's kind of interesting. So I've actually liked it because she is giving some biblical insight and pointing out some sometimes weaknesses in some of these songs, but it's still kind of cool because I've enjoyed it lately because they're focusing on Christmas stuff. So check that out if you want. It's not an easy listen, and it's a little bit deep, so it is a bit of a Bible study in a way. So More Than a Song. And the other podcast I'm back into is called Hit Parade, and it's secular music, but it's a guy that does a monthly podcast about just crazy things from the music world over the last 40, 50 years and the charts and things like that. So he recently has done some pretty fun episodes that I've enjoyed. And this one in December is Christmassy related and talks about, the title of the episode is actually Smells Like Christmas Spirit, which made me laugh because, yeah, anyway. So check out a couple of those music podcasts if you're interested in something different over the holidays.
I watched, does that mean that those two podcasts are a Give It a Try?
They are Give It a Try. Sorry, they are Give It a Try.
Okay, in that case, you will find links to both of those podcasts in the description below this video. And I'm going to do my what you're reading, what you're watching first. So I remembered watching a movie when I was in high school that I thought was really amusing, and I thought my wife might enjoy it, and I found it on Prime the other day. And so Kristen and I have been watching through The Gods Must Be Crazy. Are you familiar with this, Brian?
That's the Coke bottle?
Yeah, that's the Coke bottle.
Indeed.
And it's this fascinating story. It's so whimsical. It's on Amazon Prime right now, so if you have Prime, it's free. it's definitely worth a watch. It's just a really creative way of telling a story, and the way the narrator brings us into this guy's head to interpret what's happening through the lens of how he understands the world is really, really cool. And I've been continuing to read the Silmarillion. I'm enjoying that. It's a slow slog, but it's just very rich, and I'm liking it. So I've also got a give it a try, and this is a weird one. I've been very proud of the TGIF show that our church has been producing. If you haven't watched it, I'll put a link to it in the description below. You can take a look at the whole playlist. But ever since Pastor Tim and Gina came on staff here, they have released a weekly Christian talk show on YouTube. And I think the content that they put out, the conversations and discussions they have been really great. And I got thinking, like, I don't know that there's anything else out there like that coming from other churches. So I did a search on YouTube for Christian talk show, and honestly, I didn't find much in that vein. But strangely enough, the one that I found that was closest to TGIF is from a channel called Sonia Bhattacharya, and she is an Indian woman living in India who's a Christian who runs most of the content on her YouTube channel in English, and it's all about Christian discussion, practical advice for Christian living. She brings her pastor on. She brings other people to have discussions on. And I just found it fascinating that what I was hearing from her and her analysis of the Bible, her pastor's analysis of the Bible, was so consistent with a conversation like you and I would have, Brian. Mm-hmm. It was just baffling hearing that kind of straightforward biblical advice coming from that kind of accent. And it makes me so curious about that church and how they do in India and the community that they've built. And I'm just fascinated by it.
That's really cool.
So I'm going to recommend one of those videos where she sits down and talks with her pastor about the difference between career and calling in the life of a Christian. And it's just great.
That's interesting. That's really cool. The church in India is actually pretty strong. So that's pretty awesome. Actually.
Great.
That's neat.
It was remarkable to me how similar her experiences and interaction with Scripture were to my experience. And I loved it. Okay, so I guess we're moving on.
Raise a glass to times past.
Brian, would you like to go first as we raise a glass to
let's let you go
tribute?
first. I went first last time.
So this is something, I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but one of the things I desperately miss, and one of my favorite ways to connect with people in the world, is through playing board games. We don't always have time on a Sunday or Wednesday when we've got youth in the high school room. By the way, we're in the high school room right now, but it's been converted to this weird podcast/television studio. We used to sit down with the youth and play card games twice a week, Uno or whatever, using standard classic decks of cards. And it was one of my favorite ways to connect with them and to just engage. And so many thousands of times that we sat down for those games, and I just miss those kids so much. I got to see a few of them when we were recording the Christmas program here, and it's just I'm really bummed that I won't get to do that again before I leave staff here in a little bit. And yeah, I miss those kids so much, and that was one of the things I love doing. In fact, strange fun fact, Brian, one of the decks of cards in this room has my blood on them.
Oh, I don't think I want to know the details of that.
I'm going to tell you the details of that.
Gross.
I believe it was Mr. J.T. Terry that we had this coffee table in here that had drawers underneath it, and the drawers opened from either side. It was one really long drawer that you could access from either side of the table. And one time I went in there to get a deck of cards, and he kicked the drawer from the other side, and I didn't realize that I was bleeding until my blood was all over the cards. Nice. And I just thought that was a different, interesting keepsake. So, yeah, I probably didn't need to tell that story.
Yes, now that you have to reset your gross meters, that's okay.
Yeah, all those kids, I love them so much. I miss them, and I treasure those memories. As mundane as they were, that was a really lovely way of connecting with the students.
Raise a glass.
Hear, hear.
So mine is to the children's ministry team who are keeping our children's ministry thriving right now. You may not be aware of this if you aren't connected to the church in that way, but we have a vibrant children's ministry Wednesday nights on Zoom, and the family Christmas endeavor. You'll see a lot of those children, but it's led by volunteers, and they've just done an amazing job. So the children's ministry team has been planning. Christy Emmerich and Sydney Duenas and Carrie Swanson, and many others who have been helping that team. Gina has been involved, and just want to thank you all
Laura
for your hard
Cornell.
work, and keep it up. And we just thank you for your efforts. And I know I didn't name you all, but some of you prefer to not be named, but tough. We're glad you're doing it, and thank you for serving. Continue to serve and carry this great ministry. So raise a glass.
Here, here.
Trivia.
Story time.
Oh, trivia.
Oh, yep.
Yeah, so here's our trivia. So last week I threw out a Hobbit riddle, and the clue was, born standing up with a view of the sky, I dance in the breeze when the breeze blows by. My late life is golden, and then, when I die, I leap from my perch and learn to fly. What am I? And we got no answers for that. Brian actually answered it correctly last week when I was talking to him, but we're going to let that ride for another week, and hopefully somebody will grab that. And if they don't, we will never, ever do a riddle like that for the trivia category.
Fine.
So I actually have 2 trivia questions this week, our standard question and then a bonus one. So the category for this week's trivia question is Tabletop Hall of Fame. The clue. In Monopoly, there are cards in the community chest and chance piles that will send a player directly to jail. What are the other 2 instructions printed on those cards? It starts off with go directly to jail, and then 2 other instructions. What are they? You can send that answer to centenary1911@gmail.com.
And hopefully y'all have been playing a lot of Monopoly during the pandemic.
It's very likely. So the bonus trivia question for the week, the category is called The Final Frontier. And Brian, you and I mentioned a few, maybe a month ago, that we often write trivia questions specifically for individual listeners. So this listener will know who this person is. Okay, so the question, Majel Barrett Roddenberry quite famously appeared in the unaired pilot of Star Trek before marrying the show's creator 3 years later. But she also played 2 recurring roles and appeared in well over 100 episodes of the spin-off series Star Trek The Next Generation. What 2 recurring roles did Majel Barrett play on Star Trek The Next Generation? And as before, you can send that answer to centenary1911@gmail.com. Okay, so I guess we are on story time now.
Story time. Now.
Story time, 'cause the lockdown is boring.
So for story time, Ben is going to tell a story, but don't worry, I will be correcting him as we go.
So this is one of the strangest memories from my time here at Centenary. What year was this? Was this 2015?
I want to say it was a little earlier, maybe 2014.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, some time ago, Brian asked me for a conversation in his office, and he gave me the bad news. See, Brian knows that I hate conferences. I just don't like them. That's not a good way for me to learn. And Brian needed me to go to a very specific conference that he had wanted to attend.
I was his supervisor at the time. I was Ben's supervisor for a number of years here at Centenary. So that's important because I had to put on my supervisor hat.
Okay. Yeah, and it was a conference that he really wanted to go. It was about sort of like the crossover of worship and theology, which is, of course, in my milieu, but it's also something that is very interesting to Brian. It was something that he'd wanted to attend. He wouldn't be able to, and so he needed me to attend this conference that was going to be on a weekend. And immediately I was just groaning internally because that means a lot of different things. For one thing, it's really hard for me to get away on a weekend because I have to do all the work I would normally do to prepare for a weekend with projection and with scheduling a worship team and all that. But then I also had to do extra communication to get people in place to cover the stuff I would normally do, like set up and...
we actually had a Saturday night service at the time.
Oh, yeah!
And Ben, I believe it was on a Saturday night. And so that was adding to it. It was like a Saturday afternoon sort of evening thing. And
I think it was a 3-day conference, but you didn't need me to be there for the Friday session, just the Saturday one.
He was groaning more than just internally, too. He was grumbling and groaning verbally.
I was very audibly complaining, and I was saying even worse things behind Brian's back to my wife than I was to Brian. And she put up with me for that, thankfully. And the conference was going to be in Berkeley. It was Berkeley and not Stanford, right?
I think it was Berkeley.
Whichever one of those has a Greek theater. I remember there was a Greek theater.
I'm pretty sure it's Berkeley.
Yeah. And
so it's not even, and all the other thing about, he doesn't like to travel. Ben does not like to
I don't like going anywhere.
New places.
I'm like the kind of hobbit that doesn't go take the ring to Mordor.
Exactly. It's the kind of hobbit that would stay home with the ring and, watch video games and play video games and stuff.
And to my surprise, my wife said, yeah, that stinks, you have to go. But you know what? I'll go with you. That school has a great library. I'd love to see it. And I was really glad because if I have to go on this thing, at least I don't have to go alone. And so she, I did all the work of preparing for a weekend away and getting all my ducks in a row. And
boy, did I hear about it.
Grumbling against Brian that I have to go to this conference. But at least I had my wife with me, and that was cool. And then, so we're driving there, and the entire road, I don't like traveling. So I'm annoyed that I have to be in a car when I could be at home, and we're driving this great distance, and I have to go to this conference, and I hate conferences, and why did Brian make me do this? And it's so annoying. And Kristen has to tolerate this for however many hours it takes for us to get there. We arrive in Berkeley, and she's like, okay, we should find a place to eat because, we should have an early dinner so that you can do your conference. And she says, look up for a pizza place or something. So I'm looking up directions on my phone. We find a pizza place. We park in front of it. And I look out the window, and I see two of my closest friends in the world. And I'm so baffled. It was the kind of double take thing where I looked out the window and was like, oh, it's Angela and Julian. And I'm talking to Kristen about what we're going to have. And then I look back and, oh my gosh, Kristen, you won't believe this. Angela and Julian are here. By the way, Julian lived in Clovis at the time. Angela lived in Paso Robles. So it was so astonishing that they would both be there in Berkeley on the day when I had to go to this conference. And Kristen was trying to tell me something. I couldn't quite hear what she was saying, but I was just struggling to get my seatbelt off and to get out of the car. And I walk over to Julian and Angela, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you guys are here. And they're trying to say something. I don't hear quite what they say. And the weird thing is they don't look surprised. And then they hold up concert tickets to my favorite band, which apparently was in town that day. I'm like, oh my gosh, you guys are going to this concert and it's here today? And they have an extra ticket for me. And I have to look at that ticket and say, guys, I'm so sorry. I can't go. I have this work thing I have to do. I have to go to a conference. I can't believe this. And then, Brian, maybe this is the point where you take over the story.
That's how long Kristen and his friends had to wait until the light bulb went on above his head, and he realized that, yes, indeed, all this was a endeavor to get him to go to the concert of his favorite band that he really wanted to see, and his wife had orchestrated this massive conspiracy against him. And yes, Kristen and I had been in contact for several months, I believe, working behind Ben's back, and I had to come up with my side to get him out of Modesto, out of Centenary, out of the Saturday night service to Berkeley, all of which were very difficult things to do because Ben, like we said,
I hate going anywhere.
Yes. And so, yes, I actually had to lie, deceive, cheat, and steal. Okay, maybe not cheat and steal, but we had to construct this huge endeavor, and it was a delight to do it, honestly. And so it was a lot of fun for me, but the fact that I heard later how Ben didn't even get it when he saw his friends there,
I was
just
so
kind
dense.
Of icing on the cake, because for Ben, this is not something that he would have expected of his wife and me. Two of the most honest people he probably knows, I think. And so especially Kristen had to go through a lot of work to sort of keep this.
So not only did you both have to endure me complaining about it the whole time, she had to endure it in the car.
Yes. When
she's so close and she's been holding them for. It was torturous for her to sit in that car and hear me complain about going to this conference.
Yeah.
It was great.
Yeah.
And I fell for it. He fell for it hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah, exactly. And I've been a part of a lot of different surprises, but this is one of the most fun just because it went so long before he realized what was going on, and then had a very good evening from what I've heard. And
it was wonderful.
And it was just a lot of fun for not only Kristen to involve me, but his good friends from back in the Fresno area, and to get them to drive in from other places. And it was a great effort. So that's one example of how we love Ben.
So thank you, Brian.
Yeah, it was fun. I liked lying and deceiving. It was kind of a nice treat. And that's how I began my life of crime. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Main topic.
So on to our main topic.
So
it's actually my favorite thing to talk about. Myself.
The main topic? Oh, yourself, right.
No, I'm just kidding. This is actually going to be torture for me.
So I wanted to force Ben into this topic today because we're talking about the will of God. And Ben's had some recent experience of kind of trying to figure out God's direction for his personal and professional life, as well as that of his wife and son, and where he's going to live geographically and where he's going to serve the Lord. And so God's will was a topic of conversation between he and I, and I think it's a very important topic. And so the Bible is pretty interesting on God's will, and so we kind of want to talk about it today because I think it's a misunderstood concept sometimes, but I also think it's a really important concept, and it plays into current events in Ben Akina's life. So
certainly does.
Yes. So to get into this, how are we going to get into this, Ben? Let's see.
Well, it's just, that was my big struggle. I guess we have to tell a little bit more of the story. I actually applied for this job in late January, maybe.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that I was out pounding the pavement or anything like that. The pastor of that church actually contacted me because,
again, it's Kristen's parents' church, and they had an opening for worship pastor.
And my father-in-law told the pastor about me, and so the pastor said, I've got no reason not to trust that guy. So he reached out to me and said, hey, are you interested in hearing more about this? And I said, yeah, sure. We sat down at a Chick-fil-A in Fresno in February, and then a worldwide pandemic hit.
Yeah.
And I just kind of assumed at that point that any church in the country that had been hiring probably had different priorities in front of them at that point. So I didn't even follow up. I was, I had plenty of work to do here trying to pivot our whole ministry platform and put it online in different ways. And so I just let myself forget about it for a time. And they reached out to me again in September, and I went and led worship there in the first week in October. And then last weekend in November, they asked me to come back again, and that was fine. And they did an interview, and then they offered me the position 4 days later. And it was weird. Like, from the moment they invited me back for that first worship leading weekend, I just started taking inventory of what was going on in my life. And Kristen and I decided, like, we feel like God has really firmly grounded us here at Centenary, but we don't want to stand in the way of whatever his will is next. And so I thought, like, I started this process with them. It would be really irresponsible for me to just say, no, thanks, I'm not interested. Because I honestly wasn't interested at that point. And it was just this firm desire of, if that's where God potentially wants me, I don't want to be the person standing in the way of that. I mean, I think they had a similar conversation in the book of Acts. Wasn't it Gamaliel? No, not Gamaliel.
It was, you got me on that one.
It might have been Gamaliel,
Gamaliel.
who was saying, like, if these new upstarts in Jerusalem are genuinely rebels working against the will of God, then we don't need to do anything about it because God's going to take them down himself. But if this is God's new direction, do you really want to be the person standing in the way of that?
Right.
And that is extremely arrogant way for me to phrase it. So I wish I hadn't gone in that direction. But yeah, that's kind of where I got to thinking, like, Kristen and I really need to put aside what we want and just decide, just try to figure out, where's God leading us right now? Which one of these churches does God want us to serve? And it really wasn't even a question of the money. It was just, wherever God wants me to be, that's where I want to be. But this developed sort of an unhealthy thing that I sort of had to come to grips with as I went back and got the interview, as it became clear the church was really, really interested in potentially bringing me onto their staff. And I ended up having a lot of really valuable conversations with people that I know from ministry in Modesto, from ministry at Hume Lake, and just wanting to get all the wise counsel that I could. And one of those conversations was extremely eye-opening for me. And this person said, sometimes God presents you with two good options and intends to bless you no matter what you choose. And that was such an amazing thing for me to hear. And it wasn't necessarily that this person was saying, God will bless you no matter what you choose of these two things. He said there is a possibility that God is putting two good options in front of you and intends to bless you no matter what way you go. And it made me realize what a grossly limited view of God's will and God's provision I had in my head. And as much as I wanted to pursue God's will, what I was really motivated by was fear. And the thought that what if I choose the wrong one that God doesn't want me to do? Does that mean there's lightning bolts waiting for me down that path? And it's like, that's not the God that I see in Scripture. Like, he's not punitive about people that are genuinely seeking his will.
Right. And that's where we come into it, because God's will is not necessarily a point in time or a one and done sort of thing. You can't think of it as just one destination. I often describe it for myself as God's will is often like a river, and he's trying to say, stay between the banks of the river. Obviously, there are things I don't want you to do. I don't want Ben Aquino, with all his gifts and all his years of experience, I don't want him to go wash cars at a car wash. There's better vocational ministry for Ben, but so stay within the river. You have two good options.
But the river is deep and it is wide.
Yes, the river is hugely wide and hugely deep, because the will of God is not just one option. It's not just a point in time or even one thing. The Old Testament teachings on the will of God are so interesting, because they say things like, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, and he will make your path straight. In other words, he will direct your steps. It will be a pathway that is wide, and he will show you his way. But the way you do that is you trust the Lord. You get to know the Lord's character. Psalm 37, you delight yourself in the ways of the Lord, and he will grant you the desires of your heart. But you got to start with that idea of God's will is getting to know him and getting to know his commands and obeying him and loving him and serving him and using your gifts for his purposes. Then he'll kind of steer you and give you various options that are all within his will. So for Ben, it is his gifts, his vocation to serve the church and to lead the church in worship and various other varieties of that. But God gave him two really good options for that to happen. And then he and Kristen had to pray about which one they would choose. That's different than we often think about God's will. We think of it as there's one way, and if you don't take that one way, then you're in trouble. And that's not a biblical perspective necessarily. Obviously, sin versus not sinning is pretty clear cut. And so Jesus does talk a lot about that. But the will of God is more the character of God and the moral code of God and obeying God. That's really where you find the will of God, if that makes sense.
And for me, it really wasn't that, oh, it's obvious God wants me there, or, oh, it's obvious that God wants me here, or, oh, it's obvious that either one of these things is good. It was more, oh, it's obvious that, Ben, you've been looking at this the wrong way. That God's not trying to trick you. God
Right.
is not trying to trap you.
Right.
And just that my view of the way he was presenting me with these two choices was so unbiblical.
Yeah. And because you had gotten kind of a little bit warped by that one-way thinking, that there is only one way, and if I don't find that one way, then I'm in trouble. Then I'm essentially going to be punished for. And when it comes to both of those options were very godly sort of pursuits, they're going to lead you in good directions either way. It wasn't a choice between sin and not sin. It was a choice between two good options, essentially, for your spiritual health and your family and your ministry career and all that. So I think that's an interesting reality. When it comes to God's will, so often we make it sort of a black or white situation, and that's not the way it works, because God's will is for you to obey him and love him and follow him and serve him and his people. And where you do that geographically is not always as clear cut as we want it to make it out to be sometimes.
Yeah. And one of the other big factors that came from a conversation I had from a friend of mine from Hume Lake. Well, he's not at Hume Lake anymore, but I worked there with him 20 years ago. We've had 20 years of friendship. Holy cow. And he talked about, what is your primary job? And he just encouraged me to think of it from the direction of what's ultimately going to be the best thing for your family. And that was a really, really big thing for me. And it made me realize that, that's my first ministry in this life. That's the first one I'm called to do. And that's the only one that I ever took a solemn oath before God that I would serve and do what's best for my family first,
So what's interesting about that is he called you to your priorities to follow God more closely. And that was, what is your primary ministry? It is as a husband, as a father, before you're a worship leader, before you're a worship pastor, before you're a technology guy, you are to keep your covenant to Kristen and also to your son. And essentially that is pleasing to God. If you're keeping those commitments above your work concerns, then you're honoring God. So that's
and
a really good
Brian,
advice.
you and I have both been in ministry long enough. We've both been believers long enough to see what happens when a minister puts the health of his church before the health of his family. And it's not something that we've really seen at Centenary very much, because the two pastors I've served under here, I look at their children and I think, holy cow, they've got kids that are still connected to them and devoted to them and have good relationships with them and have astonishing relationships with God. But it's one of those things that is a big danger in our profession. Brian,
Right.
I see you're tisking a lot. Are you not wanting me to go down this path?
No.
Okay.
I fully agree with you. I just was chuckling because I think Centenary has gotten a skewed view of that because of healthy modeling from Pastor Bob and Pastor Tim of ministry as, yes, it's obviously vital. And there are times when ministry has to come first, but overall, the family should come first. The marriage should definitely come first. And Bob and Cheryl and Tim and Gina have modeled that very well. So,
one of the things that was really drawing me to stay here that I don't necessarily think was healthy was this weird, misguided belief that I had to keep my hand on this wall or else it was going to fall down. And, I think about how plugged in I am to ministry here and how much I do on this campus. And that was a genuine concern. Like, if I'm not here holding up this wall, is it going to collapse?
Right.
And God started whispering at me in little ways through conversations with people and just through other things that I would notice that, like, no, God is far more invested in the health of Centenary Church than you are, Ben. God is far more committed to keeping this church active. And if you're going to pursue this other ministry elsewhere because it's going to be a good thing for your family, he's not going to let this church crumble as a punishment to you, Ben.
Right.
And that was really, really comforting because I don't want to leave Centenary. I love this place. I love this church family. And I'm so grateful for the 10 years that I've had here. But yeah, God is so much more invested in this congregation than I am. And that made it really it took a weight off me for sure. And I even look at, like Pastor Tim and Gina and the way that they've come in. And I'm really glad that I was here to sort of help them transition into being the leaders of this church. But man, I feel so good about the next few years ahead of Centenary with those two kind of driving the bus.
And while I mentioned earlier that it's hard to imagine ministry without Ben, God will provide, and God always has. And there's been various other people around Centenary over the years. You all have walked this journey with me at times where we thought, we can't make it without so-and-so. Yes, we can, because God's church lives and God's church will thrive. Again, it'll be different. Of course it'll be different. Yeah. But that's often good, is God sometimes works through transitions to bring something new and something healthier or in different ways, and that's okay. So we have a grieving process ahead of us, and we'll walk through that, missing Ben and grieving Kristen and Ben's departure. But God's church will be fine, and God's church will grow, and that's the way it'll work. So God always provides. But yeah, that kind of unhealthy burden sometimes we feel as in vocational ministry because we do love what we do so much, and it's such a privilege. And sometimes we think, because
it is a calling.
Yeah, it is a calling. Yeah, exactly. And we feel like we're going to drop the ball if we move on to something else, and we'll hurt people in that process. And in some ways, there might be some hurt in grieving, but it's a good kind of hurt we have to work through, and not the bad kind of hurt. So, yeah.
There's a weird little vanity trap
in
that kind of thinking, though, because it might start from this selfless place of really wanting to serve the church and they can't do it without me. Pardon? Like, you think God needs you?
Right. And you start thinking God's lucky to have you on his team, and how can it possibly go on without you? It's not healthy. That becomes unhealthy and burdensome, and that's not a good place to be. So, yeah. But again, the God's will thing of being narrowed down to just one option, we often think about that, and it makes us, there's a lot of pressure there and a lot of how do I determine God's will? And I've had so many people over the years, that's their question for me. How do I know God's will for blank? And sometimes it's a spouse, sometimes it's which house to buy, sometimes it's which job. But the reality is, I always take people back to what the Bible actually says about God's will, which is if you delight yourself in the Lord and obey him, he will guide you. He will show you his will. Romans 12:1 and 2 is great examples. If you are willing to live your life as a living sacrifice, laying down your life and serving the Lord as your spiritual offering in response to what he's done for you, and you don't conform your ways to the world around you, God will transform you. He'll grow you and transform you. And then the verse 2 of Romans 12 says, you'll be able to discern his good and pleasing and perfect will. In other words, as you obey him, as he changes you, as you serve him and serve the church, God will show you his will, and you'll be able to follow the paths that he's laid out for you. And it's not just going to be one and only one when it comes to options that are good for you and good for his church.
Yeah, so going back to some of the images that we brought up before, like, do you view the choice of different options and finding God's will as, if I take a left turn here, then I'm going to be good and safe. If I take a right turn here, there's a booby trap. Or do you view it the way Brian talked about, where you're in this river of God's will, and the river is deep and it is wide, and there's a bunch of different options for where to go in there. And Brian, you mentioned that Proverbs verse a couple times, and I love the phrasing of that. It's so curious and enigmatic. It doesn't say, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will, point you toward the exact right path. No, it's such a curious phrasing. Yeah. He will make your paths straight.
Right.
And that's such an interesting phrasing for me.
Yeah.
And it doesn't say he will point you towards the right path. He will make your paths straight. Because
Yeah.
this is a God that is not limited by our ability to make the wrong choice or the right choice. This is a God that has the ability to make a path straight.
Right.
And that's so cool.
And again, we're talking to committed believers who want to please God and live a life that honors the Lord. So this is not sin versus not sinning. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about once you're a Christian and you want to do the Lord's, essentially follow the Lord's commands and live a life that honors Jesus Christ as your Savior and Lord. So how do you do that? Well, sometimes there are two good options that'll both bring you blessings. Sometimes there are 3 or 4 paths within that God will bless you equally. It's not about finding, because I think we humans think there's only one and I got to find it and I just got to, and God's going, no, obey me in the simple things, simple choices every day, and then I will make your path straight. But the obedience comes in the small things, and then when it comes to those big decisions, sometimes there isn't a wrong one. It's just which beautiful gift would you like today? Would you like gift A or gift B? You get to choose because you've been obedient and faithful, and I'm going to give you the desires of your heart either way, but you get to choose your geography, or you get to choose your address, which house to buy, or whatever, that kind of thing even. And so I think that's what it comes down to is obedience in those small things, and then God will give you the desires of your heart. So we say all this to get you thinking about God's will, because I think so often we hesitate and we're kind of paralyzed by fear at making the wrong decisions. And sometimes God just wants us to trust him. And again, the little phrase I use is God doesn't steer parked cars. In that you got to put it in gear. You got to trust the Lord and say to him, I want you to use my life and work through me. And I'm willing to trust you, and I'm willing to put it in gear. Because that's even the way that Proverbs verse starts, is you got to trust in the Lord. And you can't trust in your own understandings. You got to trust in his. And so that means sometimes just going, okay, God, I'm going to pray this morning, and I'm going to trust you to work through me and guide me. And a lot of times those decisions will be a lot easier. Not necessarily easier. They'll be more evident to you that either of those options, if you do good turn number 1 or good turn number 2, they're both good. So it's okay. So just make your decisions. Let God guide you.
One last word before we go.
So closing remarks on that topic, men?
Yeah, a lot to say. Wait, this is going to take me a second to get my thoughts in. Oh, yes. Okay. I did mention during that main topic discussion that I'm not worried about whether Centenary will stand or fall without me, because God is more invested in Centenary than even I am. But I do want to say my going opens up a lot of opportunities for other people that do have similar ministry giftings. And if any of those folks are listening to this podcast right now and you're not intimidated by computers, Centenary can definitely use you in the coming months. And there's certain things I'm leaving behind that we will want to find other people that can fill in the gaps. Somebody that understands enough about computers to learn a little bit about how to edit our website would be amazing. Somebody that has a gift for even just spotting stuff that's wrong in an audio-visual sense when you're watching a video. That's the kind of skill set that can be developed into video editing, and we will need some people to hopefully step up in some of those areas, because there will be a vacuum in those specific things left behind.
Yeah.
So if that's you, consider thinking about it, praying about it, and reaching out to us at centenary1911@gmail.com. And I'm going to say this one more thing. I am sitting here having finished my 10th year of full-time ministry at Centenary, moving on to my second full-time ministry position because a friend of mine in 2004 told me that her church needed a guitar player. And it can start with something simple. I wasn't even a very good guitar player back then, but God awoke in me this knowledge and understanding and this hunger to serve my local church. It all started with volunteering at a local church, and the amount of fulfillment that's brought to my life and the depth that that's brought to my faith as a believer has been irreplaceable. So that's enough preaching.
So pray about that. And speaking of prayer, that's really what all of you can do who are listening is pray. Pray for Ben and Kristen and Isaiah as they begin this transition. Transitions are never easy, so be praying for them and praying for Centenary as we figure out a transition plan and how we're going to cover what Ben does here. And pray for your church, pray for me, and pray that the Lord will guide Tim and Gina as they continue to lead us in this endeavor. And we call you to pray. I guess that's our first and main response right now, is to be praying for all of this. And so thank you for that, and continue to seek God's will in your everyday life, and I think prayer is a big part of that. So thank you for joining us, and stay tuned. Bye for now, everybody.
Bye, Centenary. I love you.